Now we're going to turn to our four discussants in order who are going to react to the trilogy of presentations that we heard this morning. And it's my great pleasure to start us off with our first discussant, Dr. Philip Landrigan, who is the Dean for Global Health and Ethel H. Wise Professor and Chair of the Department of Preventive Medicine at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. Dr. Landrigan is a pediatrician and epidemiologist, a professor of pediatrics, and the director of Mount Sinai's Children's Environmental Health Center. Dr. Landrigan graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1967, completed an internship in medicine and pediatrics at the Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital and a residency in pediatrics at the Children's Hospital in Boston. He also received a master's degree in occupational health and diploma of industrial health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine at the University of London. In 1987, Dr. Landrigan was elected a member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Landrigan is known for his many decades of work in protecting children against the environmental threats to health, most notably for lead and pesticides. His pioneering research on lead toxicity at low levels persuaded the U.S. government to mandate removal of lead from gasoline and paint, actions that have produced a 90% decline in the incidence of childhood lead poisoning over the last 25 years. Dr. Landrigan.
Thank you, John. So thanks to Bob Harrison and Barbara Materner and the folks who asked me to come out and participate in this event. I think Bob Harrison told me that the reason for coming was that this is going to go down as a historic day that marks a major watershed event in the history of the regulation and the control and the eventual elimination of lead poisoning in the United States. His logic was that whatever California does, the feds will eventually being the operative word, will follow, and therefore it's very important that we get it right here. So you've heard from all three of our speakers this morning, and each in their own elegant way, that the current federal lead standard that was established, in my recollection it says 1978, is based on what was strong science in that time more than 30 years ago, but is now outdated science. We've learned so much about lead in the years since then. Levels of lead that we then thought were safe for the population, we now know are not safe. And so what I'd like to do, since you've heard so much this morning and early this afternoon about the effects of lower levels of lead on adults, as somebody who's doubly trained, cross-trained in both pediatrics and occupational medicine, I'd like to talk about expand what you've already heard lightly touched upon, and that are the fetal and the developmental effects of lead. And to give you the headline first and then to drill into the details, we now know that lead is toxic to the human fetus, the human infant, the young human child, right down to the very lowest levels that are measurable. In fact, the World Health Organization has basically taken a very firm stand in a recent publication that just came out within the last year or so from WHO headquarters in Geneva, where they state in their summary of this document, I'll read you the one sentence, quote, "There appears to be no threshold level below which lead causes no injury to the developing human brain." They don't recommend a blood lead level of 0. They don't quite cross that bridge. But they do say unequivocally that there is no such thing as a safe level of lead in blood. So with that as a starting point, let me take you back a bit through history and then talk a bit about where we are today in terms of knowing about the developmental effects of lead exposure in early life. So back in the 1980s, in the early years after the establishment of the OSHA lead standard, a somewhat bizarre and unexpected consequence of the OSHA lead standard was that several companies that were handling lead instituted what were called fetal protection policies. It was known already back then that lead was toxic to infants and children at low levels. We didn't know that it was as toxic as far down as we know today, but nonetheless we knew already that there was differential toxicity between adults and children. And in recognition of that, various members of the lead industry took various measures to protect women of childbearing age against lead. And I can't speak to people's motives. I think part of it was genuine human concern. They were worried about poisoning babies and didn't want that to happen. Nobody likes to poison babies. And secondly, there were liability issues that whereas the working woman, whereas the liability of the company for damages caused to the working women was limited under workers' compensation law, there were no limits to what the fetus, the unborn child, could, any suit that that child could subsequently bring against a company that had caused elevated exposure to lead during pregnancy. So out of some mix of those various motives, fetal protection policies were established. Some companies took a more benign route to fetal protection policies and simply declared that they would not let women of childbearing age or women who were reproductively capable work with lead. That was one strategy that was employed. Another strategy, which was not done commonly but did take place and was written up in the papers at that time, was basically at least one or two employers required women of reproductive age to produce documentary evidence from a physician that they'd had a hysterectomy performed, so that they were therefore obviously incapable of bearing children. Those were the strategies that were developed in the first half, really, of the 1980s. Those strategies were ruled illegal. Good thing, I think. And they were no more. But also the fact, the dialogue that the publicity around those strategies provoked prompted a small group of us to write a couple of articles back in the 1980s. The long form of the article appeared in a journal called New Solutions, which was edited at that time by Chuck Levenstein at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. And then there was a short two-page version that appeared as an editorial in the American Journal of Public Health. And in those two articles, which basically covered the same ground, my colleagues and I, the colleagues were Ellen Silvergeld of Johns Hopkins, John Freund of UCLA, who's been mentioned here already today, the late Rick Pfeffer, who worked for Federal OSHA, and myself. We looked at the differential susceptibility of adults and children. We were catalyzed in our thinking by these heinous fetal protection policies. And in the editorial, we wrote that it's essential that both the environmental and biological standards regulating exposure to lead in the workplace be sharply reduced. We said in 1980 that present standards, which are still today's present standards, are not protective. They provide no margin of safety against subclinical lead poisoning. Rather than base new standard on issues of economic and technologic feasibility, OSHA must reset the lead standard solely on the basis of the available medical evidence. And at that time, knowing what we knew back then, some 33 years ago, we recommended that the PEL for lead in the workplace, 23 years ago, that it be reduced to 20 micrograms per cubic meter of air. We also noted that this is with regard to something that you said a moment ago, Barbara. We noted that with regard to medical removal protection, it's all well and good to think about taking women out of the workplace because of medical removal protection, but the trouble is most pregnancies aren't planned, and we know from the data that we heard this morning in the modeling talk that Dr. Vork put out that it takes a long time for lead to wash out of the bones of a pregnant woman. And so I have great difficulty thinking medical removal protection is going to work to protect the fetus against lead. I think that may be a tiny aspect of your assessment that you want to revisit. So that's the historical background I wanted to touch upon. The conversation that we're having in this room today is not new, but it's fascinating to see that after 23 years that the baton has been picked up again, picked up by the state of California. The payoffs in terms of protecting the human fetus against lead toxicity will be very great indeed. We now know from a whole series of epidemiologic studies, Herb Needleman studies, Bruce Lanphier studies, and others, the full range of the developmental neurotoxicity of lead. We learned, first of all, of course, about the loss of IQ that lead produces. We then learned about the shortening of attention span, which is part and parcel of the syndrome, the problems with executive function, which is to say the ability to make good judgments, prefrontal cortex. That function is clearly diminished by lead. All of these neurotoxic effects of lead are, as far as we now know, are permanent, they're irreversible, they're not treatable. Chelation therapy doesn't make them go away. Therefore, the only way to deal with them is to prevent the lead exposure in the first place. And in the case of fetal lead poisoning, fetal brain damage caused by lead, what one must do, what our society must do, is protect pregnant women against the effects of lead. Lastly, a word on the economic dimension of this. We did an analysis in 2002. We found that lead poisoning in the United States of America at that time was costing this country $43 billion every single year. Leo Trisandi, my colleague who's now at NYU, has recently revised that estimate in the light of more recent data, and the numbers have gone up still further. So lead poisoning, childhood lead poisoning, fetal lead poisoning remains a very expensive burden for this country. But it's also worth pointing out that we saved an extraordinary amount of money. One might call it an Avogadro's amount of money as a consequence of getting lead out of gasoline. And let me take my last 17 seconds to explain this and reassure you in California that you're absolutely on the right track here. So the Joel Schwartz at Harvard and Richard Jackson, who many of you know when he was at CDC, and some of their colleagues got together and did an economic analysis of the benefit that accrued to this country as the consequence of getting lead out of gasoline. And it went like this. They showed that the mean blood level in American children dropped between 1976 and the early 1980s, dropped from about 18 micrograms per deciliter down to around 2 micrograms per deciliter. They calculated that that drop in mean blood level produced a population-wide increase in the IQ of children born since 1980, around 4 to 5 points. And then do the arithmetic. We have 4 million babies born in this country every year. Give them each 4 or 5 points of IQ, and then put a dollar figure on the IQ point. And the economists say that an IQ point is worth about $10,000 over a lifetime in terms of increasing a person's productivity over the 40-plus years of their working life. You do that math, 4 million times 4 or 5 times 10,000, and you get an economic benefit of $200 billion in each crop of babies born in this country since 1980. That's an aggregate return to the economy of $6 trillion over the past 30 years as a consequence of getting lead out of gasoline. So anybody who talks about economics and says that it's not a good expenditure of money to lower blood lead levels, the answer is they haven't read the literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Landrigan. Our next discussant is Dr. Dale Hattis. Dr. Hattis holds a PhD in genetics from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of California here at Berkeley. For the past 39 years, Dr. Hattis has been engaged in the development and application of methodologies to assess the health, ecological, and economic impacts of regulatory actions. His work has focused on the development of methodology to incorporate inter-individual variability data and quantitative mechanistic information into risk assessments for both cancer and non-cancer endpoints. He is currently a member of the National Toxicology Program's Board of Scientific Counselors In the past, he has served as a member of the Environmental Health Committee of the EPA Science Advisory Board and as a member of the Food Quality Protection Act Science Review Board. He has been a counselor and is a fellow of the Society for Risk Analysis. Dale?
Thank you. This is a very novel and interesting experience for me because I get to revisit something that started 36 years ago, at least started for me, when I was asked to participate in a group by John Freund's and other group at MIT to try to estimate not the air-lead, blood-lead relationship. All right, sorry. Yeah, I can't wonder. Right. Okay. The idea wasn't to shed light on that because we thought we had information on that from existing studies of air leads and blood leads in battery plants and other things like that. What we wanted, what there wasn't any data on that was necessary was this new idea of having medical removal protection. That you would remove workers from exposure if they reached too large a blood lead level, like 60 or something, or 80, and keep them off exposure until they fell down to some lower blood lead level. Well, that hadn't been done before. And in order to get that regulation past the OMB, we needed to have some kind of economic analysis of what the dynamics of this kind of process would be, how much would it cost? And so I went into the literature and found two dynamic models of lead in the body, one based on a relatively limited set of 8 months observations in people by Rabinowitz. Another was done for purposes of radiation protection. They wanted to say, okay, if you ingested some radioactive lead, how much radiation dose do you expect? And for that purpose, there were some observations made in baboons. And that came out with a more complicated model. But when I compared the expectations of those models with observations of a Canadian strike before the OSARCO data existed, it turned out that blood lead levels were persisting at higher levels to a larger extent, particularly in the long tenured workers that were during and after the strike, and therefore I chose to try to apply the more complicated baboon-based model rather than the 8 months model from the human. There was only 3 compartments. So I bought myself a brand new Texas Instruments calculator that had almost 200 steps of memory. And it took a little while, so I ran it overnight under my pillow. And came out with something that could be used as a basis for predicting what the dynamics of lead might be following exposures that would raise blood lead levels up to the MRP removal concentrations in pollen. As a side benefit, it turns out that because of the long-term storage of blood lead in bone and the re-release over time, we also shed some light on what the likely expectation would be for the relationship between air lead and blood lead in long tenured workers, and that helped in evaluating the desirability of the permissible air exposure limits. But anyway, it's astonishing and gratifying to me to find that work started 36 years ago is still being used today. And the researchers in this case, Kathleen Vork, as she presented some of her results earlier, shown excellent professionalism and dedication to getting the final predictions as true to the data as possible through several painstaking iteration and thorough disclosure of the final model fits and the processes for achieving those fits. There is some opportunity for further tweaks in the kinetic modeling. First, some sensitivity analysis might be in order. The parameter set derived evidently clearly produces acceptable fits to the data, but how much would the policy relevant conclusions change with other choices of acceptable fits to the data? And this is just basically a way of communicating, you know, if you're going to say, okay, this is the time that you expect removal to happen, well, how sensitive is that to other choices that could have been made that would still produce acceptable fits? Further, we want to have workers of both sexes involved. We don't want to limit people's opportunity because of their gender. So we want to have models that recognize possible differences between the sexes in kinetics. And so it's a fair question to ask, how different would those predictions be for workers of different genders? And finally, because we're worried about lead exposure during pregnancy as affecting fetal body weights, among other important parameters, you know, how should the model be adapted for the effects of pregnancy? We think there's likely to be greater fractional uptake of lead because of the use of the same transporter system for lead that's needed for calcium. There's going to be some likely release of lead from bones in late pregnancy if enough of the calcium isn't available from the diet. And of course, it's likely to be a shorter period of pre-pregnancy exposure than a full working lifetime if you're going to have children in your 20s and 30s and 40s and maybe early 40s. In my humble opinion, low-level effects of lead amply justify efforts to further reduce worker exposures into the 5 to 10 microgram to deciliter range. Low-level effects on birth weight represent essentially an important signal for likely indirect impacts on infant mortality, neurodevelopmental impairment, and likely other effects, as Phil has already gone through. From experience with other toxins, such effects are likely to be nearly linear, more nearly linear than threshold-like, although they may be. This is an example of some toxicological data on effects of trichloroethylene, trichloroacetic acid on fetal rate response of rats. You can see that it's not exactly linear, but it's close to linear. Similar, some data of Smith for dichloroacetic acid. Essentially, the idea you should be thinking about a toxin exposure during pregnancy that it's like a tax on the resources that the developing embryo developing fetus has to grow and develop and protect itself before it gets exposed to the real world. This is a continuous relationship in people between birth weight and infant mortality. And you see it's a broad, continuous change. So if you over a broad range of prior birth weights in the absence of exposure, if you move that curve to the left, you can see that you would expect to increase overall the infant mortality rate. And this is a calculation that I won't go through in any detail that basically says that if you expect even a 1% shift in the birth weight, and if that's a signal for associated causal factors in causing the excess infant mortality, then you expect something like a 0.3 per 1,000 increase in the expected neonatal and infant mortality. So I think that's the sort of the take-home lesson, and I think means that you really ought to be taking serious account of exposures that give even a barely detectable change in the birth weight distribution in humans. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hattis, and we regret the absence of the lavalier microphone. But moving on now, Dr. Rosenman is a professor of medicine and chief of the Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine at Michigan State University. He is the co-lead also of the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists Occupational Health Subcommittee. He received his medical degree from the New York Medical College in 1975. He's a fellow of the American College of Epidemiology and the American College of Preventive Medicine. At Michigan State, his active research program in occupational and environmental disease is flourishing, with particular interest in the methodology for tracking occupational conditions, lead toxicity, and the etiology of various pulmonary diseases. Ken.
Thank you. I want to echo Phil's comments. I appreciate being invited and the importance of this in the future, and hopefully nudging, but not eventually, federal OSHA along. So I have 4 points I'd like to make. One, I think it's been stated, but I want to reemphasize that the current standard, OSHA standard for lead, is really based on acute toxicity. And Dr. Kosnet did an excellent job, over the last 35 years. The issues of adverse chronic effects from lead. And just to reminisce, I had the opportunity back in 77, 78, I was an occupational medicine resident and submitted data to the lead docket at that time. And I was working with Dr. Sid Wolf at the Public Citizen Health Research Group, and we were looking at anemia, and we found an association at 30, which, that was low at that time, because we're talking about acceptable blood leads of 80 at that time. And you had the physicians for the various lead companies arguing there was no problem below 80. And partially that was sort of self-fulfilling, because the way the regs read then, you didn't have to examine anybody if their blood lead was before 80. So clearly they didn't have symptoms because you didn't know anything about them. And even at that time, the academic research community said the acceptable blood lead was 30 or 40. Companies were arguing 80. And, it was a compromise. OSHA came up with 60. And to me, it was really a compromise decision. So I want to emphasize we've learned a lot over the last 35 years, but our standards are still based on acute toxicity data. So that was point one. The second point I want to make is, for people, maybe physicians who practice occupational medicine, they may not be used to these medical management guidelines that the California Department of Public Health have promulgated, or at least suggested as guidelines that Dr. Kosnet mentioned in the article, and they've recently been updated. But I think there's pretty broad consensus for these guidelines. And so the Council for State and Territorial Epidemiologists, which represents all the occupational health professionals at the state health departments, has endorsed these guidelines. The Association of Occupational and Environmental Clinics, which represents 60 occupational environmental medicine clinics across the country, has endorsed these guidelines. So I think there is widespread support, and I would thank California for taking the lead and coming up with these medical guidelines. The third point I want to make, reemphasize, and Dr. Materna mentioned it, is that there are aspects to the lead standard that are just not practical, and it's good to see that for instance, not tying blood leads to air levels. I mean, that's very important. Imagine how you would enforce a standard in the construction industry where you have to have an air level before you do something. I mean, things are moving too quickly there. And so there's a whole bunch of things not related to air level, not related to even the blood, where the blood leads are not, or suggested they not be tied in to the air levels. And I think that's very important. My fourth point was, you saw this slide that was distracted you all this time. So this is not my data, although the ABLE state, so this is something funded by NIOSH. the adult blood lead epidemiologic surveillance system. Barbara mentioned it in terms of California, but this is something that's been funded by NIOSH in over 40 states. And NIOSH, Dr. Steelen and his group at Emory had an R01 that took the data from 11 of the able states, because there were issues of confidentiality and how you go about following up people. So all these states have this mandatory requirement that blood leads be reported to them from their laboratory. So we're talking about all the blood leads that have occurred in these 11 states. And he followed them up using the National Death Index to look at mortality in people who had elevated blood leads. So everything's here is funded by NIOSH, so thank you, John. So what hasn't been discussed at all today, although there have been a number of studies, but there's not a good consensus. IARC has not come out and said that lead is a carcinogen, but clearly in animal studies, lead acetate is an animal carcinogen, and there is mixed data in the epidemiologic, but this is data that Dr. Steelen has shared with me. It's not published yet. He's still in the process of writing it up and presenting it. So this is, you can consider this fresh before the press here. And so we're talking about a large cohort of individuals, right? We got over 58,000 men from these 11 states. And during the follow-up period, and so these are blood leads that were done mainly in the 2000s from these 11 states. And there were approximately 3,000 deaths. So there's a strong, so these are all, 95% or so of these are workers. That's how they were exposed to their lead. And so there's a overall cause standardized mortality ratio. There's a strong healthy worker effect. So the overall risk for death is less than 1, which you would expect in a working population. There's not a long follow-up. But looking at the highest blood lead that's was reported to these 11 states, you can see at greater than 40 micrograms per deciliter, there was this increased risk of lung cancer, a 20% increased risk, and for laryngeal vocal cord cancer, 100% or so. I think in terms of looking, he did not break the data down between 5 and 10, but used those categories you see there. But there's a statistically increased risk for lung cancer with increasing exposure. So I think it's another cumulative effect that needs to be thought about in terms of cancer. It may not be what's driving the concern, but you know, this is just the beginning of the follow-up of these individuals, and hopefully there'll be more data from this group in the future. So I will end there before you showed me my 10-minute sign.
Thank you, Ken. Our fourth discussant is Dr. Leslie Israel. Dr. Israel is a clinical professor at the University of California at Irvine Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, where she serves as the Occupational Medicine Residency Program Director and the Medical Director of the Center's Specialty Practice. Dr. Israel received her internship and residency training at Yale University. She's board certified in occupational medicine, and currently she serves as the 2013 President of the Western Occupational Medical Association. Leslie?
Thank you, Dr. Howard. I want to extend a sincere thank you to the organizers of this symposium to allow WOMA, the Western Occupational Environmental Medicine Association, to lend their voice. WOMA is an organization representing over 600 occupational medicine physicians and other occupational health providers. And we cover 5 Western states: California, Hawaii, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. We're a regional component of the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And I'm very pleased to say that there are members of WOMA and ACOM in this audience, as well as hopefully online with us. I would like to recognize, though, a couple people. One of our board of directors is here in the audience, Dr. Blink. And I want to give a special note of appreciation as I've heard prior scholarly speakers talking about their history of it. Well, 20 years ago, Dr. Paul Papanek, past president of WOMA, began the push, the gentle nudge by WOMA to do something about the standard. So as you've heard, this is something that's important to all of us, and it's been especially important to the WOMA members. Why? Our WOMA members are in the trenches, and so we deal with employers, we deal with employees, we diagnose and we treat lead exposures and lead poisonings. Unfortunately, it is a concern today. So when CDPH presented these guidelines, we had the opportunity to work with their lead physician, Dr. Raymond Meister, and collaborate with the others on this. And that was followed by a letter of support in 2009. And you know, let me just say that guidelines are great, but they're not standards. And if you're in the trenches, you can understand what I'm talking about. So, and a note about the providers and knowing what's going on with the guidelines, I want to thank Dr. Kosnet as well, because he did present a webinar on these guidelines, which were very useful to our members. And again, guidelines are great. We need the standards. So in November 2009, WOMA directed a letter to the Cal OSHA director at the time, Len Welsh, supporting the revisions of the Cal OSHA lead standards. And again, it's based on the evidence you've heard. The EHP article and this guidance. Then again, in January of 2012, we directed a statement to the Cal OSHA Advisory Committee. And it was again about some revisions. It was again pushing, nudging. So relevant to today's symposium, I just want to highlight a few things which you've already heard. But some of the goals we would hope that would happen would be, again, we favor a regulatory trigger for blood lead testing, ensuring that all workers with potentially significant lead exposure, whether through inhalation or ingestion or both, are enrolled in a medical surveillance program. Again, as noted previously, frequent blood lead monitoring is essential. And in our 2012 note, we put in twice a year for exposed workers, and more frequently with blood lead levels above 10 micrograms per deciliter. We'd also favor improved triggers for preventive practices, and we list them here. Education, education, education. Education about the exposure, about hygiene practices, and PPE. So, again, education. And as Dr. Landrigan pointed out, it's education about not only the worker, but the family, and the impact it has on your family, on the worker's family, is extremely important. I mean, you've heard about the economics of it, and you've heard other things. So I'm in the trenches, and our members are in the trenches, and we think this is important. We hope that 2012 will be the year, 2014 will be the year that Cal OSHA can make this happen. So thank you very much.